Welcome to the panel on the future of NATO and transatlantic relations. After the Russian-Ukraine conflict, is Europe more focused on territorial defense at the expense of solving global challenges? Does unity of the West and the NATO-EU-OSCE security triangle exist nowadays? So what will be the future of transatlantic relations and NATO? We encourage you to debate on this issue.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to invite our special guest, Mr. Szabolcs Takács. Oh, this is a special welcome. Mr. Szabolcs Takács, Deputy State Secretary and Political Director from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary. I would like to welcome Mr. Maciej Popowski, Deputy Secretary General, European External Action Service. Dr. Francis Burwell, Vice President, Atlantic Council of the United States. Mr. Bogdan Klich, Senator from the Polish Senate and former Minister of Defense. Mr. Garry Kasparov, Chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, and Dr. Kobieracki, Director of the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center and Deputy Head of the OSCE Secretariat. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to moderate this panel, and particularly after the first session, which was on the governmental level and official statements. He will have a bit more freedom of speech, as we have also think tankers, intellectualists, strategists. And first question, as I would like to chair this session on the basis of questions and answers, and then I will yield the floor also to our wonderful audience, and I know we have very rhetorical one and capable to ask very tough questions, among others. My first question, I would like to share with Mr. Popowski. As we are discussing about future of NATO and transatlantic relations, it's very often that we are concerned in Europe about level of our European security. And now, these days, we observe tendencies that common security and defense policy is going somehow on the second position. As a priority, we are trying to position NATO. And do you agree on it that European Union member states are trying to focus more on strengthening NATO these days, and they are somehow omitting European Union potential in this area? How would you respond to this?
Thank you very much, and good morning. Well, if I were to agree, I will be fired tomorrow. So I won't agree. But I think that there's a basic misunderstanding about this whole discussion, because there is no comparison between NATO's commitment to collective defense and CSDP. The nature of the policy, the framework is different. CSDP is expeditionary by nature. We have we have in theory a commitment, a possibility of a commitment of common defense in the treaty, but it has never been used. And this framework has not changed. And of course now the European countries who happen to be both members of NATO and the European Union turn their attention to the, let's say, Article 5 commitments, which is only natural. But the outcome of the NATO summit in Wales does have an impact on the current discussion on the future of CSDP for a number of reasons. First of all, there is now a lot of political attention. A lot of political attention is being devoted to the issue of development of European defense capabilities. And the capabilities have no color. So if the Europeans get their act together and get serious about defense and develop their capabilities, at least maintain them, stop the decline in the defense budget, invest in the industry, and there will be more output. The output, European capabilities, would benefit both NATO, the European Union, and the nations individually. And the second aspect is certainly, I would highlight three. So the second would be a natural division of labor between NATO and the EU. I would be the last person on earth to plea for a formal agreement on who does what, because it would never work. But as NATO is now, as I call it sometimes, going back to its roots, Article 5, common defense, deterrence, there is more scope for engagement for the European Union elsewhere. Different expeditionary activities, I mean, capacity building in third countries, in the Balkans or in Africa and in other places. We are engaging in regions and countries where NATO is not willing, sometimes not able to engage. And I think the trend will continue. And the third aspect is the general threat perception. That was something that Minister Klich mentioned just before the break. Well, the start of a new discussion on a European security strategy or strategic framework. This is, I mean, the ongoing debate at NATO is having an effect on our debate and also on this tasking giving to the High Representative, the current High Representative Federica Mogherini, to carry out an assessment of this changed strategic environment Europe is operating in, which may lead at some point, sooner rather than later, to an update of the European security strategy of 2003.
Thank you very much. Let me ask the second question to Dr. Francis Burwell from the Atlantic Council, so we can take a different perspective on transatlantic relations. Dr. Burwell, is NATO important still for the United States?
Yes. Yes, very definitely. In fact, what I think that we have seen over the last 18 months to a year has been a real recommitment on the part of the United States to a NATO that is now refocused on common defense. And I think we've seen this in the President's speech in Warsaw and also here in Tallinn. And I think we're seeing it in the enhanced deployments or participation by US forces in exercises here in Europe. Not everyone will come to Poland. I know there will always be people who will argue that there should be even greater US participation. It's a fact we're not going back to the troop levels of the Cold War, which are roughly 4 times what they are today for European forces, US forces in Europe. But I do think you see greater awareness of what is going on in Europe and an extremely firm commitment to Article 5 in terms of the NATO member states. But this has raised some other issues, and I think some of these were mentioned this morning. One of them is the capabilities. And I don't want to spend time talking about the 2% issue because I think that's not really the key issue. The key issue is if we're now looking at a new type of conflict, hybrid warfare, are we in fact prepared for this kind of conflict within the alliance? What will we do if there are riots in one of the Baltic states and these are used as an excuse? If normal political demonstrations get a little out of hand and they're used as an excuse, what will we do? Will we be able to deploy troops, or is that too much because what we have is the very conventional type of warfare, troops aimed at conventional warfare? So I think that we need, as an alliance, to think about how we are going to deal with this type of possibility, this type of scenario. I was very interested earlier this morning in the first panel with the discussions about the European Summit in June and the lead up to that on security issues, because I think this is something that the alliance, that NATO cannot do by itself. Coming up against hybrid warfare, this involves not only cybersecurity, different types of military engagement. It will require thinking about energy supplies and energy union. It will require thinking about public diplomacy and campaigns against disinformation. And these are not things that the alliance can do itself. These are issues for the member states and for the European Union. So I think that the US is very much committed to this. We of course have responsibilities around the world, but I do think that we will see enhanced engagement with NATO, and we will also see a series of debates that has to do about what we are doing with NATO, both in NATO territory, which is its key function, and also outside. How do we bring in partners? It was also mentioned this morning that Europe faces not only the challenge of the East, but the challenge of the South. So Turkey, a NATO member, faces some very real security issues on its border with Syria. How do we respond to those? What happens if they really go bad? One of the most interesting things about the NATO summit was the agreement on strikes against ISIL. And that's not a NATO agreement, but clearly it involves our NATO partners. So I think there's a big discussion to be had about partnership and NATO as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My next question I would like to dedicate to Mr. Takács. Sir, do you agree that alliances are based on trust and solidarity, loyalty? I think it's pretty obvious. And therefore, I would like to ask you a question. What would you say about Visegrad? What about the region that shares primarily the same values? When we're joining NATO, when we're joining European Union, we perceived ourselves as partners in this process. And now we are observing kind of deterioration and the problems between our Visegrad in our Visegrad alliance. So do we still share the same values?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, very warm welcome to everyone, and congratulations to the organizers for convening this distinguished event once again. It's important that we organize security events like this in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, because obviously we have a somewhat different perception of security, looking at the things from this geographical location. But answering your question, I am very happy to express my view that I think that Visegrad is alive and kicking. It's a natural alliance of long-standing historical partners. And of course, when we are talking about the perception of security, I think most of the cases, this is identical in the four countries of Visegrad. And this year, 2014, we are celebrating a very important anniversary, 15 years of NATO membership, of my country, of this host country, Poland and the Czech Republic, and our Slovak friends joined 5 years later. And they are all celebrating now the 10th anniversary. And if I may recall the event, when Hungary joined in 1999, a couple of days later, NATO started to have airstrikes in one of our neighbors. And many people put up the question to us that, was it worth joining an alliance and get engaged in a war? And we said, yes, of course, it was worth. Because the perception of security level has changed, ultimately, on the minds of Hungarian people. We were fortunate enough in this part of the world that subsequent to the end of the Cold War, everybody thought that a long area of peace has arrived. Now apparently it has ended, because the challenges that you were talking about also in the first panel of this forum, from the east, from the south, definitely has a very serious impact on our security environment. Now, I think it's obvious that when we are talking an alliance, trust, reliability, these are principles that must apply, and they do apply. And they do apply. And of course, the challenge that the Ukrainian crisis poses to Europe in general and to the member states of the European Union in particular are different. Because we have different vulnerabilities, we have somewhat different interests. But after all, we must look at the facts. We must look at the conclusions of the NATO summit, consensual-based conclusions, but also in the European Union structures. Whatever European Union leaders decide in connection with sanctions or other political messages. And just 2 weeks ago in the Slovak capital, we had a meeting of the foreign ministers of the Visegrad Group together with the foreign minister of the United Kingdom, and jointly they issued a statement in which they assessed the so-called pseudo-elections in Donbass with the same message. And in mid-December, the foreign ministers of Visegrad are planning a joint visit to Kiev to discuss the challenges and the latest developments with our Ukrainian partners. And also, Mr. Popowski was talking about EU and CSDP. I think last December's European Council outlined a good vision for CSDP, and within the context of CSDP, the Visegrad countries are working hard to set up a joint battle group, Visegrad battle group, that might be applied as a deterrence, but also in one of the expeditionary missions of the European Union. So, yes, I agree. Now, there are serious challenges that we have to discuss, but I think the Visegrad leaders are always open for a constructive dialogue and resolving the differences of opinions.
Thank you for your optimism. And next question I would like to ask to Mr. Garry Kasparov. Sir, you know well Russian elites, I think more than most of us. And I believe you understand very well also the mentality of the people that are at the Kremlin right now, more than we. And my question is, do you think that measures undertaken by NATO, by EU, against Russian aggression in Ukraine, at least that's how we see it, how I see it, do you think that these measures are adequate? Are they strong enough to stop or change the policy of Russian Federation?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at such a prestigious forum. Thank you also, Zbigniew, for using the right word, aggression, instead of the diplomatic word, crisis. That's calling things what it is in real life. I think it's very important, before we talk about this future strategy, that we do a proper evaluation of the position. That's how I play chess in my previous life. I think there were some good remarks at the first session about misinterpretation of the facts. Because very often we are jumped in this circle of intellectual self-deception. Yeah, we don't want to recognize certain facts because if we do, then we have to act. And while it's nice to talk about continuing dialogue, it's very important to understand that dialogue as tango requires two. And before you start a dialogue, you should recognize whether the opposite side has the same interest, some strategic interest. And I heard the same mantra about we have common strategic interest. I believe it's all nonsense. There is no common strategic ground between European Union and Vladimir Putin, simply because Europe's future is based on stability, certainty, predictability. European nations, they believe in certain institutions, democratic institutions and international treaties. And the future of Europe as a whole or separate European countries depends very much on the ability to predict this future and to keep this mutual respect as a part of cooperation. Now, the future of Vladimir Putin's power lies exactly with the opposite, with uncertainty. I mean, one of the simple reasons, Putin badly needs high oil prices. What is the #1 factor to push oil prices up? Uncertainty. Does he need resolution of Iranian crisis? No. Does he need to stop the war in the Middle East? No, because all these positive resolutions will eventually bring the oil price down. And again, it's all a matter of survival. Right now, I think we should recognize that what has been happening in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and unfortunately, I believe will happen in other places in the former Soviet Union, is a Putin's desperate fight for survival. He is in power for 15 years. I hope nobody counts 4 years of his puppet in power as technically in power as a real presidential term. And as every dictator, he needs a mythology to present the argument for the public, because he's planning to stay there forever. And we are dealing in Russia with the most dangerous form of governance. It's a one-man dictatorship. It's far more dangerous than the Soviet Politburo or modern China, because when you have institutions, even as clandestine as Politburo, you still have number of people, and these numbers, whether it's a 10, 20, or a Central Committee of the Communist Party, they tend to fight very drastic decisions. They're looking for some form of, again, predictability, because there's a common interest. One-man dictatorship is more likely in North Korea. It's not as grotesque as North Korea, but we know that the survival of North Korean dictatorship based on invention of the foreign threat. And right now, Putin has been doing exactly the same. Russian propaganda machine has been fueled by Ukrainian news from Ukraine, and I see no way for Putin to roll it back. I also think that, again, NATO should recognize that the nature of this threat is very different. For 20 years, many people in Europe have been struggling with the future of NATO. So what we're going to do, because European security was taken as granted. That's why NATO looked at the Middle East, at Africa, at other regions, Afghanistan. So it seemed that Europe was fixed forever. Now, the real threat comes from inside. And it's impossible to cope with these threats around the world unless you fix your base. And the base is not fixed. And that's why NATO has to consider that, that's the actions in Ukraine, it's not the end of the story. There's a long list of things that people believe Putin would never do, and he's done them. And if you want to hear about his plans, just read his speeches. Because he has a pretty good record in delivering what he said, maybe later. Unfortunately, now it happens sooner than before. But it's a pretty good picture of what is in his mind, and he's fully in charge. And going back to your question is, the message from Europe, from the West, should not aim Vladimir Putin as a target. He burned all the bridges. He's not going to leave Kremlin. I can bet my bottom dollar he'll die in Kremlin. Nobody knows when and how, including him, but he'll stay there. But there are many people surrounding him that might be still thinking about their own future without Putin. And it's very important that the measures presented by Europe, they are not reactive, but proactive. It's about deterrence. We hear a lot about what Europe will not do. No boots on the ground, no military solutions. Yes, we know that, but why are you talking about it? Because Putin reads it as a sign of weakness. When you negotiate, you don't tell your opponent what you will not do. You have to tell the opponent what you will do, even if you don't want to do that. But it creates better ground for negotiation. So far, I think we should recognize that this is not a game of chess. This is more like a game of poker. And Putin has a great ability to bluff. He can have a very weak hand. Everybody talks about weak Russian economy and the problems. But if you bluff in poker, you can undermine the weakness of your hand, because your opponents always fold out their cards. So it's about NATO actually coming up with recognition of the fact that there are threats around the globe. And these threats are some form of response to globalization. Whether you talk about Putin or about ISIS or about Al-Qaeda, all these groups, whether they're terrorists or states, they are fighting globalization as the liberalization of economies, of democracies. And the success of this concept means the end of their rule. So they are, by definition, the enemies of what is the core of European Union. And look at Putin's actions. It's not necessarily invading the other countries. It's about undermining the institutions like NATO and European Union that guarantee the security of Europe and the rest of the world. And it's not by accident that European far right, some of them on pure ideological basis, some of them for some more pragmatic reasons, they are the biggest admirers of Putin because they share the same view towards Europe. Undermining institutions that represent the core of the global stability, that's Putin's main goal, and we should remember that. And I share the nice sentiment that treating everybody as a potential friend is a good idea. But when you shake hands with the bear, you'd better count your fingers. And I would say you'd better have a loaded gun in the other hand.
Thank you very much. I think it's not only important voice and very. We all have the pictures of what you said in our minds, but it's also important because you as a Russian, it means even more. My next question is to Minister Klich. We know, sir, that defense spendings are crucial for the strength and efficiency of our security policies. But at the same time, we observe, inside of NATO particularly, that many countries are still limiting their spendings on defense. What would you tell those nations or their leaders to wake them up, to tell them that maybe they are wrong and we are right by increasing our spendings?
Thank you very much for the opportunity of attending this conference and including this question about our military financial side of our military engagement, because capabilities create one of the crucial dimensions of our ability to act, to act. And this is the ongoing discussion within the alliance, by the way, also within the European Union, about our readiness not only to increase our defense budgets, but also to use those funds that we have at our disposal more effectively. It was Lord Robertson several years ago, 14 or 15 years ago, that used this famous sentence, it is not only important to spend more, but to more effectively use our funds. Yeah? And one should be aware that there were several initiatives during last years within the alliance and within the European Union as well that were oriented to increase our capabilities, to make them more, to create them in a more modern way. Yeah? Like DCI, for example, several years ago, like Prague capability commitments at the beginning of the former decade, but we were not successful in acquiring those new capabilities that would be at the disposal of all the members of the alliance. So in the financial crisis that emerged at the end of 1998, this question about how to acquire new capabilities necessary for modern warfare received an additional value in the situation of reductions of the budgets. We have two forms, one of them in the alliance, the other one in the EU, of two programs that are crucial for the future of capabilities. This is, of course, pooling and sharing and smart defense. Of course, procurement is only one of the aspects of those forms of cooperation in this area of capabilities. The other one is solidarity that is expressed by those two forms. Let's take the note that one of the projects included into the smart defense, it is without doubts air policing mission over the Baltic states that used to be continued since the entrance of accession of those countries to the alliance. Another one, this is the missile defense. It is not only about, smart defense is not only about acquiring new capabilities, but also about cooperation in the military solidarity with the other partners and members of the alliance. I want to say that, of course, this requirement to increase the military budget has to be connected with more effective use of those funds that we have at our disposal, and this is the crucial challenge for the alliance and for the European Union. Secondly, what is also important, this is the spirit of solidarity. The spirit of solidarity that was shown, fortunately and very visibly, after the Russian invasion on Crimea and after the invasion of that country in Donbass. That's a critical message that the West sends to the Kremlin and to the other parts of the world, that the visible assurance that was introduced into our strategic concept at the end of 2010 is not only a paper version of our solidarity, that the visible assurance is practiced in the situation of a real threat. Yeah? In that case, the threat from the eastern neighborhood of the alliance. But the same we can say about the presence of American, Dutch, German Patriot missiles on the territory of Turkey, when the southern neighborhood of the alliance is also diplomatically speaking unstable. We witness right now the kind of crescent of fire that surround us from the southern and from the eastern part of our neighborhood. That's why the expression of solidarity is one of the crucial elements, you know, of the cohesion of alliance and, of course, credibility of NATO. So not only increasing budgets, also more effective way of using the funds, and necessary solidarity that we show to the audience inside and outside the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. My next question is to Ambassador Kobieracki. Sir, it is, of course, not only the gestures in the hands of NATO to provide security for Europe. OSCE also plays a significant role. We can observe it as an example that Minsk agreement was achieved under auspices of OSCE. But as we see, Russian side is not fully following that what they agreed. Do you see any options for OSCE to be more effective in their work? And particularly where we see quite many provocations, particularly recently in Ukraine, where OSCE is becoming sometimes misused by provocateurs to present that OSCE is legitimizing some processes and so on. So do you see a bigger role, or do you see any chances for improving the role of OSCE in the conflicts like, for instance, between Russia and Ukraine?
First of all, I told you before that I'm a very undisciplined panelist, so before addressing your question, I'd like to make two comments on things that have been already said. Minister Klich referred to Lord Robertson. Just to stress how different security landscape is today, I still remember first ever Lord Robertson's visit to Poland as NATO Secretary General, and his first ever press conference in Warsaw, which he started with early 2001, yeah. Which he started by saying, I quote, "I'm so happy to be here with you today in Moscow." I don't think any NATO Secretary General today would make such a mistake. Then Mr. Kasparov referred to a need for all of us to read what President Putin is saying, because he usually does what he says. I read recently his statement at Valdai Forum, and actually three things got my personal attention. First, he did say at Valdai that Russia tried to solve the problems in a civilized manner, but it proved impossible. Second, he did refer to military potential as the most important criterion for defining superpower position. And third, he said that Russia has made her choice and would never follow so-called Western values. It would rather be satisfied with kind of, did he say, old Russian patriotic values, something like that. Now, my personal conclusion from those three elements is that so-called response, international community or Western response to the current crisis and obvious changes in the security landscape, first of all, should be multifaceted, not just military. It should involve all available instruments, military, political, economic, financial, diplomatic. Second, that we need, first of all, to focus on values, norms, standards, rules of the game that would be adhered to, and not about any ideas of creating new European security institutions. We don't need institutions. We need clear rules of the game. Now, as to your question, the role, the future of the OSCE. First of all, when I was leaving Warsaw in 2011 to work for the OSCE in Vienna, at that time there were still colleagues in the Polish MFA who were confusing abbreviations, OSCE with OECD. It's not the case anymore after the Ukrainian crisis. Ukrainian crisis for the OSCE is a kind of a revival or an opportunity that OSCE is actually using. But what OSCE is different from, let's say, other organizations and institutions that we are talking about today. What OSCE can do, OSCE can offer a framework within which each participating states can do things and solve issues. OSCE as such, listen, it's an organization based on consensus rule. It's been quite often accused of being just a talking shop. Now it's not perceived as talking shop anymore because of the involvement in the Ukrainian crisis, first of all, but more as a bridge builder, if you wish. But still, what it can do, it can offer a framework, and it's up to participating states, up to respective capitals, how this framework would be used. Now, we can, of course, expect changes or certain, let's say, changes in the way OSCE is operating, kind of reform of the OSCE. But fortunately, this time it will not come from a negotiation on a beautiful structure on paper. This will come as an adaptation to the real world because of the involvement in Ukraine. And it's a learning process for all of us. That is something clearly seen in the OSCE. There is a kind of a side effect, if you wish, of the crisis in and around Ukraine, which is that all so-called protracted or frozen conflicts that OSCE has been dealing with for years have become even more frozen. There's no progress whatsoever on Nagorno-Karabakh this year, no progress whatsoever on Transnistria, and on other things. There were references, I think, during the first session that even a question whether it would be advisable to keep a channel for dialogue with Russian Federation open. And this channel, at least in the OSCE, is open. The question is how it is being used. There will be, in something like 10 days, OSCE ministerial session in Basel, and this year, contrary to previous occasions, we actually expect not so much formal decisions in Basel, but we expect a good ministerial level discussion on Ukraine, how to solve Ukrainian crisis, and then, once the dust will settle, how to discuss European security, the future of European security. Once more, not talking about new institutions, but more in terms of rules of the game. And it's also a kind of a new experience for the OSCE, because this year, a bit contrary to our experience from the past, we have all very high-level guests knocking on our doors. Can you invite us to Basel? Because we want to talk to you. It's from NATO, from other institutions. Jokes apart, the most important part of Basel Ministerial will be ministerial level discussion on the future of OSCE involvement in Ukraine and how we can help to solve this crisis. And whoever wants to be in this game has to come to Warsaw. You also referred to provocations vis-à-vis OSCE in Ukraine. You know, to assess something as provocation, you would have to be clear and certain about intentions. It's not that simple. There is a bit of chaos in the east and south part of Ukraine. There are groups, armed groups, who are not controlled by anybody. And there are groups of separatists, rebels, however you call them, who are controlled by we don't know whom, or at least we don't know officially whom. There is at least one armed group whose kind of commander, if you wish, is a veteran from Chechnya and the Balkan Wars. Those people are unpredictable. Yes, there are incidents. Our patrol got under fire yesterday in the so-called security zone. There were cases of jamming of our drones and even an effort to shut it down. So there are incidents, I wouldn't say daily, but quite often. But whether they are provocations, it's a different thing. The main reason it's a bit chaotic situation in Donbass, and the fact that the so-called contact line, which was supposed to be a kind of a center of security zone, which we, OSCE, are supposed to monitor, keeps changing almost every day. There are 75 Russian military officers and Ukrainian military officers in the so-called Joint Coordination and Control Center, actually working on that issue for several weeks now. And I'm sorry to say, the map keeps changing. That's one of the reasons for incidents which some may call provocations, but it's difficult to be clear about it. That's one lesson.
Thank you very much for this first-hand impressions from the east of Ukraine. Now I would like to yield the floor to our wonderful public, and I would like to encourage you to ask questions to our wonderful panelists. Who would like to be first? Okay, here we have one hand, there we have a second one, and there we will have a third one. Okay, so could you provide microphone? And I see also Ambassador Novak, I see, of course, but we'll try to collect the first questions in the first row. Okay, so please provide microphone. We'll collect all 3 questions at least.
I am not the first one.
Please, it's okay. We will ask all. We'll collect all the questions. Please identify yourself. And
my name is Octavian Milewski. I'm from Moldova. I'm here with a group of new security leaders. It's a program sponsored by European Academy of Diplomacy and Kazimir Popowski Foundation. My question would be to Mr. Garry Kasparov. I totally agree with your assessment of Russia as a dictatorship, but I'm afraid, at least in my assessment, I'm afraid that it's a collective dictatorship. There is a collective Putin which backs the Putin in Kremlin. And there is possibly another collective Putin, a wider one, which backs him by casting the ballot, the voting ballot, each time Putin needs to or feels like re-legitimizing himself in a way or another. My question would be, how do we engage these two segments of Russian society which back the Putin regime? Thank you.
Let me collect maybe 3 questions, okay? Please provide microphone to the second person. Here in the second, third row. The microphone is coming. Can we secure one more microphone so it will be faster?
Of course. Sorry. Thank you very much. My name is Per Nyholm. I'm from Denmark. I'm not a politician. I am not a diplomat. I'm a journalist, getting a bit gray, and therefore not really a journalist anymore, but a so-called commentator. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation. Second, a question which has been engaging me recently, and not the least after a return to the United States, where I had the pleasure of staying for about 3 months, not having been there for 30 years. I was left with a feeling that we have to discuss in Europe the long-term viability of NATO in its present form. I am not so sure that we will succeed over the next, let's say, 10 years to keep NATO as it is now, based on the military power of the United States. There's something is going on in the United States. It's of a demographic nature. The white ruling class, if I may say so, is now rapidly dying away in Washington. We already have a so-called black president. There's a shift in the direction of many more Latins, Asians, and Africans coming in. And the remaining white power group, if I may say so, Republicans and Democrats, are not as Europe-oriented as it was earlier, but is, so to say, returning into a kind of provincial isolationism. I think we are going to have a real problem here in no later than 10 years from now. And I think it's important, and maybe some of the distinguished panelists could have an opinion on this. Is it, first of all, is it moving in that direction? Is that a possibility? Second, if the possibility or the risk is there, what do we do in Europe? How do we organize our defenses 10 years from now? Because if something is going to happen within 10 years, it is about time we start organizing now. It's about time we start finding out what kind of a defense are we going to have. Could we have, say, an American-European defense? Are the Europeans, with their capacities, say the British and the French nuclear arms, can we, 500 million Europeans, come up with a credible defense in 10 years? And as a matter of fact, maybe the basic, I mentioned 500 million Europeans. Can the 500 million Europeans expect in the long run to have their defenses here in a situation where the Americans are concentrating increasingly on the Pacific and on China? Can we expect here that 350 million Americans are going to finance and man our defenses?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Ambassador Novak and Charles, yes?
Thank you very much. I have a rather general and simple question to the members of the panel. It is a request to make a brief comment on the yesterday's statement by the Russian foreign minister, who said once again that the NATO enlargement is one of the, not only of the biggest mistakes, but one of the reasons of destabilization in Europe. And he went on to say that the change of Ukrainian neutrality status, I think he used a little bit different word than neutrality, non-engagement or something else, is also one of the most dangerous things, because it will destabilize Ukraine, Europe, etc. That is not exactly new, but that is something for the future, because sooner or later, if there will be an effort to talk with Russia, this argument will come to the table, will be put on the table. So how shall we react to that? That is also directed to the Western public opinion. The famous article of Meschheimer and many people follow this line, that we have entered Russian, in fact, I mean NATO has entered, in fact, the Russian sphere of privileged interests, and we have now the result. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last question in this group, in the first row here.
Thank you. Good morning. Charles Frederick is my name, and I'm with Plan 8 Management Group, a U.S. defense contractor. Talking about the movement of NATO and their presence towards more into Central and Eastern Europe, should it happen, and to what level? Can it happen? What would be the message that such a movement sends? What would would it make strategic sense? And would it be an effective use of funds to upgrade military establishments and installations here in Central and Eastern Europe?
Thank you very much. So who would like to start first, and with which question? Ladies first. We are in Poland.
Let me respond to this question about the long-term viability of NATO given U.S. demographics. It is a fact that the United States is becoming what we call a minority-majority country, and many of our cities already are. We do see increased diversity among the American population, just as you do see here in Europe. And in fact, some European countries now are facing serious challenges in terms of the percentage of foreign-born people who are within their borders and how you will integrate them. For a number of years, we have been hearing about the successor generation, i.e., will NATO still be viable as the generation that is not part of the post-World War II consensus moves from the scene. And I have to say that I personally have heard this argument for 30 years, but I've not yet actually seen it mature into practice. I do see that the increasing diversity of the United States doesn't really affect the values of the United States. And in fact, I would say that even those individuals who come from different backgrounds and more international backgrounds within a couple of generations are, if anything, more internationalist and more aware of international questions than are those whose families have been in the United States for some time. And I do think that it is the values that really attract them to maintaining the systems that support those values, including NATO. But I would also mention something else. You know, a security alliance is not something that your normal citizen thinks about every day. They just don't, especially if you're in a large country that's protected by 2 oceans. But it is something that we think about when we feel threatened. And you've seen us turn to our partners after 9/11 and now in the struggle against ISIS. But the thing that people think about more commonly is trade and economics. And we now have a huge experiment going on, and that's the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that's being negotiated. We are the 2 largest economies, and we are each other's largest economic partners. We are the biggest investors in Europe, and Europe is the biggest investor in the United States. If you go up on Capitol Hill and you try to talk to members of Congress about TTIP, what it means to them is European companies investing in their districts. We have 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic that are part of this complex of being supported by European companies in the US and US companies in Europe. For everyday Americans, this is a big deal. And it's very different from a huge trade deficit with China, if I can be blunt about it. We don't have that level of investment in China. We don't have that level of economic activity with China or US investment in China. And sometimes it's proven very difficult in terms of contracts, et cetera. So it is the everyday economic activity. It is the standards that we have about that activity that I think are part of the very strong foundation that we continue to have underneath the alliance. Would it be great if the 500 Europeans could figure out how to more effectively use their defense dollars, as has been said by several of my panelists, so that they could, in fact, provide the type of defense rather than relying as much on 350 million Americans? On the other hand, I think we're there with you, because this struggle that we're facing right now in Ukraine, it is about rule of law and democracy and freedom and the ability of Ukrainians to choose. And it is, if not challenged, a challenge to the very core of not only our alliance, but the same values that those many immigrants to the United States have sought over many generations.
Thank you very much. Minister Klich and Mr. Kasparov.
Actually, it was one of the most crucial questions that was raised here on the American presence in Europe. I share this opinion expressed by you that that this is one of the biggest challenges for both sides, for Americans themselves and for us in Europe. How to keep in Americans and how to convince American political elites to use Europe as one of the tools, still the tool, of the foreign and security policy of the United States in new circumstances. Of course, I'm pretty sure that the policy of rebalancing the pivot to Asia will be continued, because Washington knows where there are fruits of the quick economic progress in that part of the world, and that it is absolutely necessary for the future of the US to create a new shape of relationship with China. So without doubts, this policy will be continued. But I'm not sure if the military doctrine, this one that was presented by President Obama in January 2012, at the beginning of 2012, has to be continued as well. This military doctrine that, that assumes that the new shape of deployment of American troops in the world should be introduced. Americans introduced to some extent this new functional, I would say, not heavy deployment, but functional deployment on the rotational basis, not only in Europe, but also in the other parts of the world. It is costly effective, but also it gives the chance, the better chance to train those units, those troops that are much more mobile if they are deployed even to the far distances. But this doctrine can be changed because of the new situation in the South and because of the new situation of the East in Europe. Once again, this ring of fire, this instability in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East can be one of the reasons for redefinition of this military doctrine in the future. There is only one precondition, that after the presidential elections, the United States presidential elections, we'll have another president maybe from Republican elite that would be much more in favor of using the military force in distant areas. That's first. Secondly, the precondition for keeping Americans in, this is our European responsibility. If we still have the crisis of our CSDP, I name it not the stagnation, I name it the crisis. This is the similar crisis that we overcome 10 years ago, the crisis over the Iraqi involvement. But this crisis is unfortunately much more profound, because this is the result of the financial and institutional crisis of the European Union during last years. Ambassador Popowski is one of the authors of far-reaching perspective for the progress, for the recovery and the progress of the European Union. The report that was submitted by Catherine Ashton was promising, I would say, although in the first part, at the beginning, it showed the lack of the long-term vision of the progress development of the CSDP. As far as I remember this sentence. But we began last autumn and December the recovery of our European security and defense policy. And the success of this recovery of CSDP is one of the preconditions of convincing Americans to stay in.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kasparov.
It's a very important question about the structure of this dictatorship in Russia, and I don't think we have time to go into this philosophical debate, about the role of a person in such a system. Naturally, Hitler and Stalin were immensely popular in respect to the Soviet Union and Germany at the late 30s, and that's why when we talk about Putin's popularity today, I wouldn't trust very much the polling, because polling means that somebody calls you. It's an anonymous call. And for a person who was born and raised in the Soviet Union to answer the question of an anonymous caller, whether you like Mr. Putin or not, is quite a challenge. Actually, I'm more surprised that about 20% of people still give negative answer. But having said that, yes, we should agree that the annexation of Crimea, added to Putin's popularity. Again, it's the same problem that happened before. If we go back to the 30s, at certain point, people, whether it's an inner circle or a larger group of the elite or a population as a whole, they believe that Führer, dictator, whatever the name is invincible, and they want to follow his lucky star. We know from Winston Churchill memoirs and from other witnesses of that time that German generals were not quite convinced about the ability of the Third Reich to attack neighboring nations in 37 or 38. But when everything worked so nicely, when without a single shot, territories have been taken away and the West basically capitulated, they believed that they had no other choice but to follow the Führer. So Putin's success in Crimea, by just taking it away, virtually with no even force used, so created this illusion of invincibility. And it's very dangerous that at certain point, the whole nation could become affected by this aura of invincibility of the leader, and it could be too late. So what is very important today is actually to send a message. It's to ruling elite and to Russian public as a whole that there will be a price. And it should be done on a regular basis, because we could see that 24/7 propaganda has been working. It's quite amazing to see the effect of this 24/7 brainwashing machine on all Russian TV channels having effect, because it's very difficult to resist the pressure, and there are no counter actions. There's no strong message that will articulate the price. Words like Nuremberg Tribunal, Hague, they should be repeated. The Russian generals and those who are working, on the economic ministries, Putin's government, they should recognize they carry responsibility for the blatant aggression against Ukraine. And again, we keep talking Ukraine. 6 years ago, Russia already invaded a neighboring country. But we should remember that at that time, Putin was not so arrogant politically to annex territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And today's annexation of Crimea, it was the first annexation since 1945, okay, if we don't mention Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. It's quite an historical irony that Russia never had any territorial claims to Ukraine. To the contrary, there were a number of contracts signed, or international treaties. In 91, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 94, Budapest Memorandum. By the way, Ukraine agreed to give up nuclear weapon in exchange for recognition of territorial integrity, alongside with Belarus and Kazakhstan. There are potentially other targets that Putin is not even hiding, in his future plans. if we let it go, as a new geopolitical reality, it's a Pandora box. Yeah. And just, and following the question that was asked about Russia's concerns, I don't understand, what you're talking about. Are we in Europe? Are we here to deny the will of 45 million people because a paranoid dictator in Kremlin believes that, he can use any argument to justify him staying in power? It's a choice of Ukrainian people. And the reason Putin attacked Ukraine, because he was scared to death. It was an existential threat for a second largest Slavic nation in the former Soviet Union to move in Europe and to send a message to people in Moscow and Russia, in other Russian cities, that, there's a choice. And, you're talking about these concerns and pretending that Ukraine could be a buffer state. This is not for us to decide. It seems that Ukrainians made a decision. And while we're talking about, resolving this crisis, and Minsk agreement has been mentioned already probably 50 times this morning, I mean, let's remember, it's an intermediate step. It's an armistice. This is not a solution. It's about freezing the conflict. It's great to stop, the bloodshed. But the end of the crisis, it's the way I understand it, it's a full restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity and return to the map that has been internationally recognized. Before it's done, there is no resolution. And we know from history, it's not, of course, as perfect science as mathematics, that engagement covered in the form of appeasement always failed. And I don't know what is the price of confronting Mr. Putin today. It could be high. But what I know from history, and I doubt anybody will seriously argue, tomorrow the price will be higher. In 1936, to stop Hitler would be one price. In 1937, it's different. In 1938, higher. In 1939, too late. And if somebody says that it's very difficult to confront Putin today because now, number of reasons. One of them is supply of gas and oil to Europe. But let's not forget, Russia supplies Europe, it's about 1/3 of European consumption of gas and oil. Europe buys about 80%, actually more than 80% of Russian gas and oil export. Now, who has the leverage? Tell me. And I'm almost wondering, is it more difficult today to confront Putin that in 1948 confronting Joseph Stalin, who invaded already half of Europe and decided to take over West Berlin? And for 11 months, American and British planes have been supplying West Berlin with everything they needed. And by the way, Stalin hasn't shot a single American plane. Why? Because every dictator has a great animal instincts. They strive without weaknesses and indecisiveness, but they feel strengths, and they always backed off. Again, let's learn from history, and let's not pretend that appeasement will work because it always failed before.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Kobieracki wanted to contribute.
Just to react to Ambassador Novak's comment, actually the rule is clear. The less confidence and trust in Europe, the more we hear about Russian concerns about NATO expansion. But I'm almost personally offended that Ambassador Novak, my old friend and my boss some years ago, was so selective in his quotation from Minister Lavrov, because actually what Minister said was, after the Cold War, we had an excellent chance to make OSCE the most important security organization in Europe, and we failed. That's one of the reasons for which I said we don't need to talk about security institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr.
Thank you very much. Just two very short reactions to two questions. One of them is the future of NATO and the sustainability of NATO with the United States participation and the enlargement of the alliance. Well, I believe that the transatlantic alliance of NATO is not only about a military umbrella, but it's also a community of values. And it will always be important for any American leadership, regardless of any demographic developments in the United States, to join an alliance with the European members. But at the same time, it's obviously true that the European members of NATO, especially those including my country, which has not fulfilled its obligations so far in increasing the budget to show commitment from our side also to NATO must be fulfilled, especially but not only because of the latest challenges. So I think there's a very, very clear obligation from our side, and we have to do it. Maybe the 2% is not that realistic these days for Europe, just coming out of a very serious economic and financial crisis, facing a lot of challenges of unemployment and economic slowdown. But certainly the increase of our budget must be convincing enough to show our commitment. So this is one thing. The other reflection to the enlargement of NATO and how it is perceived and what propaganda purposes it is used by. And further to what Mr. Kasparov said about the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on the non-nuclear status of Ukraine in return for a guarantee of her territorial integrity and sovereignty. It was not Ukraine which breached this contract of 1995. So it's not only about the extension of NATO as a military alliance, but when NATO is extended, it also extends the area of a community of values. And maybe this is more threatening than the military dimension of the alliance. And from our side, the Hungarian government is very consistent on our support to NATO enlargement in the case of Georgia now and also the Western Balkan states, for a simple reason, because we believe that we need stability on our borders as a nation and our borders as a European Union. And we cannot see any social stability, social development and economic development without a clear perception of security and the feeling of security by the societies. So it must be, we cannot leave it to others. It must be our decision whether we extend NATO or not, and the decision of those societies which would like to join.
Thank you very much. Mr. Popowski.
Thank you very much. Three brief remarks. First, I mean, on this issue of ethnic diversity, I mean, I don't have a clear view on the consequences in the US. I would only say that in Europe we are just discovering the consequences of our own ethnic diversity, looking at the example of foreign fighters. So this may be much a bigger challenge for us than it is for the United States because of well, the history of your nation. On this Europe's response to US new strategic orientation, in the strategic guidance that Minister Klich mentioned, there is a clear reference to Europe as a security provider and no longer only a security consumer. And this is exactly what we need to do. I fully agree with you. I mean, we need to get our act together, reinvest in defense under any flag, European or NATO. You know, this word pivot has become very fashionable since 2012. But some may say that, you know, the United States would like to not only pivot away from Europe, in some cases they would like to pivot with Europe and to do something, or they would expect us to do something or to do more in our own neighborhood, whether it's in the Balkans, in North Africa, or in Eastern Europe. So that's the direction of travel. I don't think that the American priorities would change abruptly when it comes to the engagement with Asia. It just opens up a lot of space for the European Union to get serious about defense. Now on Mr. Lavrov's statement, I think it's just another salvo in the propaganda war. I don't think we should engage in that discussion because then it would mean that we accept the logic of the spheres of influence, which I hope we don't. People tend to forget that NATO's membership was not imposed on anyone. I mean, that was a decision by an organization and a sovereign nation, I mean, in each case individually, to accede to a community, value-based community. And that's exactly something that, I mean, something that shows that we really need to be able to develop a counter-narrative in that whole debate. I mean, we are not that good in countering the Russian propaganda war. I think we should do much better, both NATO and the European Union.
Thank you very much. As we have still about 8 minutes. So I would like to yield the floor for 2 last questions. And I think I see the lady's hand somewhere there. So I would like to encourage to ask. And I see okay, 3 questions, but please be very brief, okay? So we start from where the microphone is.
Thank you. My name is Marek Świerczyński. I'm from TVN24 News Channel. First of all, thank you, Ambassador Kobieracki, for reminding us this famous gaffe by Lord Robertson about being in Moscow while being in Warsaw. I just hope that nobody would mistake Warsaw for Moscow again today. But my question is to Francis Burwell. In following to what Garry Kasparov said about confronting Putin, has the US made this change in mindset already from cooperation, as difficult as it is, to confrontation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The second question, I think, was somewhere in the middle. Oh, I see the hand.
Jarosław Grys, National Defense University. I have one question, maybe naive, addressed to Mr. Garry Kasparov, concerning Russian people approachment toward the Russian-Ukrainian war. How do they feel long and short-term policy of Vladimir Putin, and how they recognize the goals of this policy, and what do they accept as the ultimate, I would say, way of success? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question over there.
Thank you. My name is Gabriela von Habsburg. I was Georgian ambassador to Germany and now representing a Georgian think tank. My question is mainly going to Mr. Garry Kasparov. Do you see any peaceful means in changing this poker game, as you pointed out, because I don't think we have like 10 years left to think about it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, who would like to start first? Fran.
Thank you. Let me first, before talking about the US mindset, underscore what has been said about the CSDP. I think there was a time in the United States when this was seen as quite a challenge. That time is gone. I think there is nothing you can do to better ensure US engagement in Europe than to really jumpstart both European commitments to NATO and CSDP. And those are not contradictory in my mind. So I agree with what has been said very much by my colleagues up here. In terms of the US mindset, I think that there is no doubt, certainly in the foreign policy community in Washington and among the leadership, that what has happened in Ukraine is illegal and unacceptable. There is a desire not to go back to a very strict division that we had in the Cold War, where cooperation with the then Soviet Union was seen as almost impossible. So we have to find the balance between confrontation over the actions that are illegal and unacceptable, and increasing, I would say, already very high concern about the particular regime and Mr. Putin himself. And at the same time, the need to try to stay engaged, to not make this everything even more of a confrontation between peoples, as it was during the Cold War. And I think that's going to be a difficult balance, both within Europe. I was in Germany last week, and certainly there is a great deal of, I would say, firmness on the sanctions issue. But there is a desire to continue to engage with Russians and to try and keep channels of communication open. It is easier in the United States, to be honest, to drift all the way into total confrontation because we do not have the economic relationship that most of Europe has with Russia, to be very blunt about it. But I do think there is a desire, both because of such things as the Iran negotiations, our space program, and other things of that ilk, to retain some cooperation. And I think there also is a desire not to create any more than Mr. Putin has already created, the views in the Russian public of confrontation. So I think we have to keep a clear eye on the actions and the people who are particularly responsible for those actions, even at the very top, and the Russian people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kasparov.
Speaking about Russian people, I think it's very hard to evaluate now the overall mood in the country. A lot of people are victims of the propaganda. As you know, the drug users, they are being abused by those who supply drugs. And unfortunately, the dose has been increased on the regular basis. They require treatment, not punishment, but it's very difficult yet to communicate the message. That's why we talked about, confronting Russian propaganda, both here and inside Russia. The people have to hear the alternative version. Don't think that you should not think of internet as the ultimate solution, because there are very few people they can actually have access to, not to internet. Probably 80 million Russians have access to internet, maybe more. But there's a very small portion of this number of those who are following the news from the free internet, because most of these websites are banned, and Russian internet is also dominated by Kremlin-controlled entities. I think that it's about stating and repeating time and again about the price for these acts. First of all, for Russian elite, for those who can influence the decision-making, and for those who should be able to find their own solution. Because there is no peaceful solution in Russia. Unfortunately, I think we passed the moment where Russia could expect peaceful transition to a more stable democratic society. It's a one-man dictatorship, and the man is not going to leave Kremlin on his own. So it's all about the final price that my country and the rest of the world will pay for the collapse of this regime. The collapse of communism led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Naturally, the collapse of Putin's regime may lead to quite dramatic consequences. And again, we should think about them. It's, instead of trying to look for, for some ideal scenario, we should stop, this wishful thinking and start asking tough questions. Referring to Putin's speech in Valdai, there was another remark he made. He praised Nikita Khrushchev for being a brilliant politician, not for releasing millions of people from Gulag, but for blackmailing America with nuclear weapon. It's almost quote unquote. So the man thinks about nuclear weapon as the bargaining chip in putting pressure on the free world. So you have no ground to negotiate with him. But again, a lot of people behind him might consider seriously their own strategic interests, especially those, and there are hundreds or not thousands of families that have their assets, their kids abroad. So it's about comprehensive approach. Again, military strength is important. Because when you don't think there's a threat, you don't invest in defense. When you don't invest, you want to pretend there is no threat. It's like a classical dilemma with chicken and egg, with too many chickens around. You could look at all these elements of financial pressure, political pressure. That's again with dramatic interest of Russian elite abroad, with hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian hard currency reserves in the western part of the world. They don't keep this money in Chinese banks or Iranian banks. So there are many ways of sending this message. But the message should be clear, and they should receive it on the regular basis. I still hope that the price for Putin's rule will not be too high for my country. But so far, again, we're seeing that he's pushing the country to the abyss, and considering the size of Russia and the craziness of its dictator, again, I think we should prepare for the worst. I mean, let's be cautious and pessimistic today, then sorry tomorrow.
Thank you very much. These were the last words of this panel. And before I will ask you to share our gratitude for these very exciting comments, I just would like to excuse. I would like to excuse our partners, sponsors, our colleagues from MBDA and Thales, because I didn't mention them in the introductory remarks. Sorry guys, without you it wouldn't be possible to do this event, and please, sorry very much. And, but concluding our panel, I would just use two phrases. I think less concerns, more actions. And that's what Europe, NATO, and Ukraine, and also Russia needs. Thank you very much, and I hope you will join me in applause to our friends. Thank you.